power over the governance of our digital lives. That's been a real dominant theme in the news lately, as really symbolized by Mark Zuckerberg's hearings in Congress and the clash of worlds that we saw there. Now, this map is a version of a map that's put out twice a year by a social media marketing entrepreneur in Italy. And I like to show his maps. This is the latest iteration. And the blue is all the countries where Facebook is the most popular social network in that country. And then you have China and Russia as the holdouts with Contactia, which is owned by Mail.ru, and Qzone, which is owned by Tencent. And then you have a little bit of Instagram and Odnoklassniki, which is another Russian language thing. But basically, Facebook is the sovereign of our social media space in the world. This is a map of the top global websites, the most popular websites per country, according to the Alexa ranking. And all of that blue is Google. So in all the countries that are blue, Google is the most popular, most visited website in the world, Google search. The pink is YouTube, also owned by Google, and the orange is Baidu in China, and the green is Contactia, again, the Russian social network. So that kind of gives you a sense of this, I think, sort of when we look at these maps, we get a sense of the clash of sovereignties that are going on and the power that some of these platforms have over our lives. Which brings us to ranking digital rights and our index. So we're evaluating 22 of the world's most powerful internet, mobile, and telecommunications companies on their disclosed commitments and policies that affect their users' freedom of expression and privacy. And you'll be able to see the list in this handout that we put on everybody's chair, so you don't have to squint to and memorize the names of the companies there. But having seen those other maps, that kind of helps give you a sense of why we chose this particular set of companies due to resources. Of course, if we could rank many more companies, we would, but this is what we were able to do. So we have a range of the widest ranging, most popularly used US-based platforms, plus Apple, which of course is the most popular mobile phone platform, in addition to Samsung, which we also cover from South Korea. We also, because of that map, you'll see we needed to look at some Chinese and Russian internet and social media companies. So we have 2 Chinese and 2 Russian internet platforms in the ranking. And then we rank 10 telecommunications companies which have been selected for distribution and reach. So the idea is that when you add up these 22 companies, both the telecommunications companies that people depend on to access the internet platforms and use their network devices, plus the platform, the biggest, most powerful platforms themselves, you get a collection of companies that are shaping the digital lives of the majority of the world's internet users. So that's the rationale for our selection. And we looked at the mobile ecosystems of Google Android as well, in addition to Apple and Samsung, which uses Google Android. And so we evaluated these 22 companies across several services each, and as well as their group level, corporate level policies. And so that's kind of the range there. And the point of evaluating them on their commitments and disclosures is simple but important. Because when power is exercised on us, either by companies directly for their own business reasons, or by governments, or by other third parties that are using or manipulating these platforms, we need to know. We need to know who can exercise power over our digital lives under what circumstances. We need to be able to understand who's exercising this power if we're going to hold power accountable. And so a key to that, of course, we need government transparency. We need governments to respect rights. And there are a number of indexes, Freedom House and others, that are looking at that. So we're focusing on our companies being maximally transparent about all the ways that their businesses and their interactions with other actors such as governments in the course of doing their business operations may affect users' privacy and freedom of expression. So that's the point of the index and the questions we ask. So here is the overarching score. We asked 35 different questions that we call indicators, and when you add up the answers, the scores for all 35 questions, this is how it stacks up. But what's actually more interesting, and you can again see the ranking on here, so you don't need to squint, and those watching on the webcast can go to rankingdigitalrights.org and peruse all the data. But what gets more interesting is when you dig down into the specific questions and the categories. So in this slide, you have the overarching score on the left, but then you have the questions, the indicators divided into 3 different categories. One category is governance. So we're looking at, does the company have an overarching commitment to users' freedom of expression and privacy as human rights? Do they carry out due diligence, risk assessment on, what are the ways in which a user's freedom of expression or privacy might be put at risk in the course of the business operations? Is there board and executive level oversight over these risks and impacts? Are there effective grievance mechanisms? Is there stakeholder engagement? Are companies part of formal multi-stakeholder initiatives that actually verify and help them advance their commitments? And so on. So that's what governance is looking at. And you'll see the companies aren't stacking up in the same order in governance as they are in their overall scores. Freedom of expression, it's not free for all. Who allows the most speech of all kinds gets the prize. That's not the point. We're talking about freedom in the context of human rights, right? So we expect that there are rules, that it shouldn't be allowed that you use your social media account to organize a massacre against your neighbors. That is not a human rights compatible exercise of freedom of expression. But when there are limits, they need to be necessary and proportionate. When governments are making demands of companies, it needs to be transparent about how that relationship is happening. And companies need to be clear with their users about what the rules are that they're setting themselves for behavior on their platforms and networks, how those rules are enforced, and the volume and nature of content being removed. And there needs to be, again, risk assessment and engagement with stakeholders about how these rules are being enforced if we are going to ensure that freedom of expression is respected for users on these platforms and networks. And then privacy is looking at 3 different buckets. We look at what's often called consumer privacy, or some people shorthand these days call the Facebook data issues. So the entire life cycle of people's data. Is the company being maximally transparent about what it's collecting, with whom it's sharing, what it's doing with your data, and giving you maximum control and agency over what's collected and shared and what happens to your data? And then we're also looking for transparency about government demands. So are companies issuing thorough transparency reports about the volume and nature of user information they're being asked to take down, to hand over to governments? And we're also looking at security. So are the companies showing clear evidence that they are making maximum efforts to secure user data? And I'll show some examples here. The index with 35 questions, obviously I'm not going to go through the results of everything here. I'm going to kind of give some highlights. So what's very interesting is that this year, the 2018 index ranked the companies, evaluated companies on the same methodology as we used last year. And there's been quite a bit of improvement, actually. 17 of the 22 companies showed improvements. And online and in the report, you'll be able to see more detail about exactly how each company improved. What's quite interesting on the telecommunications side is you see 3 European telecommunications companies had the most improvement: Telefonica, Vodafone, and Orange. And in large part, that's because they joined something called the Global Network Initiative. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But we also saw a fair amount of improvement from Chinese companies Baidu and Tencent, which is very interesting. The indicators they improved on were not related to government demands. They're really not capable, in a position to be more transparent about government demands, but everything related to kind of commercial data collection, in terms of service enforcement and security, they're actually starting to compete with one another on. So that's very interesting. And we know that while they don't engage with us formally, we know that they're paying attention to their results. So it's an interesting example of where we're managing to have impact in some unexpected places. So coming back to the governance results, that first category, what's been very interesting to see is the extent to which companies that are members of the Global Network Initiative, which is an initiative that gets companies to make commitments to respect freedom of expression and privacy in the context of government demands. So when governments are asking companies to censor content or hand over user data, are they conducting due diligence? Are they pushing back? And are they being maximally transparent? Do they conduct human rights impact assessments? And we're seeing much more thorough governance structures and practices taking place among Global Network Initiative companies than other companies. So that's an interesting thing to think about. It's also interesting on the very specific question of, does the company conduct a comprehensive human rights impact assessment that covers both privacy and freedom of expression, and not just government demands, but terms of service enforcement and other commercial practices. There's variation among the Global Network Initiative companies, but the evidence of human rights impact assessment by non-GNI companies is quite scant. So that kind of points to an effect that the GNI is having on companies, actually at least putting, not that they're perfect, when things play out, as we know, but at least that there's oversight and impact assessment mechanisms being put into place. So moving on to freedom of expression. So at the layer of the telecommunications companies, of course, and anybody who, in the United States, you don't necessarily encounter these things so much kind of on the public internet, although you might in universities, a block page, 404 error, this page cannot be found. And so what we're looking for with telecommunications companies is transparency about what government demands they're receiving. Do they have a process for evaluating those demands? Are they only responding to lawful demands? Because governments sometimes make demands that aren't even in compliance with their own law. And with the telecommunications companies, when we ask how transparent are telecommunications companies about the handling of external demands to censor content and restrict accounts, you only really had 3 companies that disclose much information just about their process for handling government demands. And the light green bar is showing that really there's only 2 companies among the telecommunication companies that provide any data at all about the number of requests they're getting and what they're responding to. So we have very low levels of transparency in the telecommunications sector about censorship and blocking demands. And when it comes to network shutdowns, also very little transparency, although you're seeing strong, meaningful improvement by Global Network Initiative telecommunications companies in terms of their efforts to be transparent about government shutdowns, network shutdowns, when a network is completely cut off in an entire region. Bharti Airtel in India, where there were like 64 shutdowns last year, very little information about what happens when they get a shutdown order, let alone the volume and nature of shutdowns that they're complying with. Coming to internet companies, we have, of course, many of you will be familiar with a post getting removed on Facebook or a video being blocked on YouTube in a particular jurisdiction, or in China, this is a block page, a very cute block page on Weibo, their equivalent of Twitter. And so the question is, how transparent are companies about that kind of thing at the platform level? Twitter and Facebook, these are examples of transparency reporting they've been doing. The transparency is best when it comes to reporting on government demands, although some companies, particularly Twitter and Google report a lot of information about other types of demands, for instance, right to be forgotten, takedown requests in Europe. But Google's also been tracking government censorship demands for a long time, and you can see that spike in the volume of demands they've been getting over the past couple years. So this is one reason why having these transparency reports is so important, because you can see the patterns in what governments are demanding of companies. So this is the two indicators where we're looking at how transparent are the internet and mobile ecosystem companies about their rules and how they're enforced. So in addition to government demands or external demands, they're enforcing their terms of service. You know, people are flagging content, but they're also proactively taking down terrorist content or hate speech and other things. And there's a fair amount of transparency about what the rules are, but up until when we ended the research, there was a lot less transparency, a lot less reporting about the volume and nature of takedowns that are happening to enforce company terms of service. One thing that's really great is just 2 days ago, Google released a new transparency report for YouTube where they actually started releasing data on the volume of takedown requests on YouTube. And so like just in the last 2 months of 2017, there were like 8 million takedowns on YouTube to enforce the terms of service, and they have data about sort of the breakdown of the different types of content and so on. And so that's a really good step, and many of us have been kind of pushing this and sort of giving them bad scores for lack of transparency for a long time, so we're very encouraged. Also, the fact that Facebook just this week released a lot more information about its community guidelines and how those are enforced. Again, we're really pleased to see that and hope that we'll be able to, that this will reflect improved scores around those types of questions for the coming year. However, when you get to the questions in our privacy category about how transparent are companies about the handling of user information, so this again is the life cycle, what's being collected, with whom it's being shared, under what circumstances, how much control do people have. Interestingly, as of January, when we finished our comparative analysis, Twitter was disclosing the most information, but you'll see they didn't even really get a passing grade, right? They got an F, and everybody else is varying gradations of F below that. And you'll see that Facebook there, which is, you know, kind of in the back of its peer group as of January, you know, when its score was the same as AT&T, and all the telecommunications companies went down from there. So one of the things that people are not talking about so much is the fact that actually most telcos are way worse than Facebook when it comes to transparency about what's being collected and shared and used and how and so on. So so that's a debate worth beginning to have. In our so this indicator is looking specifically at transparency about, from internet and mobile platforms, about what user information is shared and with whom. Kakao, a Korean company where they have actually quite strong privacy regulation, perform much better than everybody else. And you'll see Google not so good. So when you go through the specific indicators, even though Google kind of on average is disclosing more information about more things, on some specific indicators that particularly get to its business model, you're seeing less disclosure. So that's kind of an interesting thing to drill down in the research. Let me see, this clicker is slightly, there we go. On the question that's what I like to call the Cambridge Analytica question, how transparent are internet and mobile ecosystem companies about options users have to control their own information? As of January, Facebook was dead last, behind 2 Chinese and 2 Russian companies. Now, they have since released some more information, and again, since we haven't done the thorough comparative analysis with all the companies, I can't tell you exactly how much their score would have improved based on what they have recently released. But my hypothesis, I think it's fair to say, it may have moved forward a little bit, but it has not put itself at the front of the pack. That a lot of the clarifications it released were just kind of rewording of existing policies and reorganizing. There have been a few meaningful improvements, but I wouldn't say enough to put them at the front. On another indicator related to privacy, how transparent are internet and mobile ecosystem companies about tracking users across the internet? This is where, you know, they're tracking what you're doing on other websites through cookies and beacons and other things. Facebook had the least transparency of everybody, and Apple was the only company that actually commits not to track you across the internet. So that's also something, you know, we should be looking for and asking companies to do a better job of. To the security questions, so we have a number of security questions. One of them is how transparent are companies about policies for responding to data breaches? So that's kind of the Equifax question. Apple was the only company in the internet and mobile space that discloses any sort of what its policies are for dealing with data breaches. And there were, you know, 3 telcos that disclosed something, but otherwise, companies are talking to regulators, but they're not talking to their users about what their policies are in this. Another security indicator, how transparent are companies about their security oversight processes? So are they doing third-party security audits of their systems? Kakao and Google on the internet and mobile side got full marks. Everybody else is pretty mediocre in the internet and mobile space, and AT&T was the only one to get full marks in the telco space. And of course, AT&T has other issues, as we all know from the Snowden documents, but at least when it comes to security breaches, they're taking it seriously and actually telling their users. So there's a lot more in the report and in the index, but I don't want to take up all the time. We have a number of recommendations throughout the report, kind of in the executive summary are the top line ones, but then in each chapter we get into more granular ones, and we have individual company report cards where we have recommendations for each company. So I recommend, you know, if you're interested in what we're telling Facebook it ought to do, or Twitter, or Telefonica, you can look at those report cards. But more broadly, we need to see strengthened governance and greater seriousness about risk assessment across the industry. And we need to see risk assessment not just around government demands, but around business practices and models, both in terms of service enforcement and how advertising is used, how data is used for advertising, and so on, and to do that in a human rights context. And we're not seeing enough of that. We need meaningful grievance and remedy mechanisms. One of the other announcements Facebook came out with this week was somewhat improved ability to actually seek remedy if a post is deleted, which hadn't been possible previously and was one of the reasons they had a very low score on that. But in general, grievance and remedy, the ability of users to be able to go to the company and say, you know, my rights have been violated as a result of something related to your business and I need redress is very poor. Transparency and accountability, been talking about that already, why it's important, why for all the companies, there are always some things that are hard to improve unless you have an improvement in law, and there are a number of legal obstacles that prevent companies from being transparent in many markets. But in every case, there are things companies could improve today without any legal or policy reform, and that we as advocates can be pushing them to improve. More information, more control over information and content for users. And we just also need to see more innovation. We need to see companies really thinking about, is this design, is this business model actually compatible with the kind of political and social and human rights framework that we want for ourselves and for our children? And companies are not asking those questions enough at the beginning. We also have recommendations for governments. Data protection laws are very important. We often see companies, particularly telcos, disclosing minimal information about what they're doing with data just because the law doesn't require them to. And so we need to impose more consequences on companies that fail to disclose information. We need government support for strong security and encryption. We need transparency and accountability by governments about the demands they're making to companies, and that is a huge failing, pretty much across the board. And just generally, governments need to commit to maximize the ability of companies that they have jurisdiction over to respect users' rights. And again, we get into more details in our recommendations. So just to give you a quick preview, this is the website. You can go into the menu. You can look at every single indicator and how every company performed on every service for every indicator. You know, this is kind of a screenshot of one of the indicator things, and you can click on Facebook and see how it broke down with all the different services and all the elements. So you can get very granular in terms of what you're looking for. Next steps. Right now, we don't have questions about algorithms, artificial intelligence, or advertising overtly, other than the sharing of user data with advertisers. So we're thinking about how we can add questions to our methodology in the future that deal with these issues, and particularly risk assessment and transparency around these things. We also have partnerships. We're working with Consumer Reports. Tatev Sargsyan, who's here, is working directly with Consumer Reports to figure out how we apply parts of our methodology to evaluate Internet of Things. That's quite a messy, scary area in terms of respect for rights. And increasingly, there are NGOs and researchers around the world that are taking our methodology and adapting it locally. So from New York City, the New School did a report taking our methodology and evaluating ISPs in New York City. And we also, here's another example of Social Media Exchange in Lebanon, evaluated telcos across the Arab region on their privacy policies. And, you know, it was kind of a abysmal story there. So we're encouraging people to take our methodology and adapt it to their own regions, their own issues. And that's it. And with that, I'm going to do my role of thanks. We have an incredible team, most of whom are not here because our team is distributed. So sitting in Budapest right now, we have Amy Brulette, our senior research manager, research and editorial manager. We have Lisa Gutermuth in Berlin, who's our program manager. We have Laura Reed, our senior research analyst, who is right here. Andrea Hackel, who's normally in DC, currently in Austria, is a research analyst as well. Tatev Sargsyan is a senior research fellow working with us on Consumer Reports. Then that's our team. So not a big team. We're also supported by New America's Open Technology Institute and particularly Allison Yost in communications. The Share Foundation did our website, which is their really fabulous group based in Serbia. And our funders, we do not take corporate funding. We are funded by 3 foundations, MacArthur, Ford, and Open Society Foundation, plus the State Department Democracy, Rights, and Labor Bureau Internet Freedom Program. So that's our funding. And I also want to thank just the incredible group of, there's a couple dozen researchers who've been collaborating with us and contributing to our research, without whom this index would not have been possible. So with that, I will sit down and we can talk.
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca. So just before I come to the other panelists, I just wanted to follow up. You could look at what you presented this morning.